The relentless howl of a Montana snowstorm echoed through the vast expanse of forest surrounding Jake Fisher's isolated cabin. The wind whipped mercilessly, driving snow in horizontal sheets that obscured everything beyond a few feet. Jake, a man in his late 30s with weathered features and eyes that spoke of deep sorrow, trudged through knee-deep drifts, his breath forming clouds of frost in the frigid air. As he pushed against the gale, memories of warmer days flashed through his mind. Just a year ago, he had been living in a cozy suburban home in Missoula with his wife, Emily. They had been high school sweethearts, their love blossoming amidst the beauty of Montana's landscapes. Emily, with her infectious laugh and boundless optimism, had been the light of Jake's life. When they found out they were expecting their first child, it felt like all their dreams were coming true. But fate had other plans. On a crisp autumn morning, as Emily was driving to her prenatal checkup, a drunk driver ran a red light. The crash was devastating. In the blink of an eye, Jake lost both his wife and their unborn child. The world he had known, the future he had planned, shattered into a million pieces. In the aftermath of the tragedy, Jake couldn't bear to stay in Missoula. Every street corner, every familiar face, seemed to echo with the ghosts of what could have been. Unable to cope with the constant reminders and well-meaning but painful sympathy from friends and neighbors, he retreated to this remote cabin in the Bitterroot Mountains. It was a place his grandfather had built decades ago, a refuge Jake had visited during childhood summers. Now, as he battled against the elements, Jake reflected on how the past year had passed in a blur of grief and isolation. He had thrown himself into the physical labor of maintaining the cabin and surrounding property, finding a grim solace in the ache of his muscles and the mindless repetition of chopping wood, repairing fences, and battling the ever-encroaching wilderness. The harsh Montana winter seemed to mirror the frozen state of his heart, locked in an endless season of loss. Jake finally reached the woodpile, partially sheltered by a lean-to at the edge of the clearing. His gloved hands, numb from the cold, fumbled with the top covering the stack of split logs. As he loaded his arms with firewood, he couldn't help but think of how Emily would tease him about his lumberjack look whenever he'd done this chore at their old home. The memory brought a painful lump to his throat. With a grunt, Jake hefted the load and began the arduous trek back to the cabin. The wind had picked up even more, driving icy needles into any exposed skin. He lowered his head, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. The cabin, a sturdy structure of rough-hewn logs, slowly came into view through the swirling snow. As he approached the porch, a sound caught his attention, faint and almost lost in the howling wind. Jake paused, tilting his head to listen. There it was again, a whimper, high-pitched and fragile. At first, he thought it might be his imagination playing tricks on him. After all, he'd grown accustomed to hearing things in the long, lonely silences of his self-imposed exile. Phantom laughter, the ghost of Emily's voice calling his name, his mind had conjured them all in the depths of his grief. But this sound persisted, a plaintive cry cutting through the biting cold. Jake's brow furrowed. Setting down the firewood on the porch, he stood still, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. It seemed to be coming from the edge of the forest, near a cluster of pine trees that stood like sentinels against the white backdrop of the storm. Curiosity warred with caution in Jake's mind. He hadn't ventured far from the cabin in days, content to wait out the worst of the blizzard. But something about that cry tugged at him, stirring feelings he thought had been buried along with his wife and unborn child. With a sigh that clouded the air in front of him, Jake trudged back down the porch steps. He pulled his coat tighter around himself and grabbed a lantern from its hook by the door. The weak, yellow light barely penetrated the curtain of falling snow, but it was better than nothing. Jake moved slowly, his boots crunching through the fresh powder. The whimpering grew louder as he approached the tree line, interrupted by occasional yips that sounded desperate and afraid. Pushing aside low-hanging branches heavy with snow, Jake swept the lantern's beam across the ground. At first, he saw nothing but white. Then, a flash of gold caught his eye. Nestled at the base of a large pine, half buried in a drift, was a small, shivering bundle of fur. As Jake drew closer, he realized it was a puppy, a golden retriever by the looks of it, though it was hard to tell under the matting of ice and snow. The puppy's eyes, large and pleading, locked onto Jake. Its tail gave a feeble wag, more hope than greeting. Jake felt something stir in his chest, an emotion he couldn't quite name. It had been so long since he'd felt anything other than grief and numbness. "Hey there, little fella," Jake murmured, his voice rough from disuse. He crouched down, holding out a gloved hand. The puppy stretched its neck, sniffing cautiously before giving Jake's fingers a tentative lick. 1,000 questions raced through Jake's mind. Where had this puppy come from? The nearest town was miles away, and he hadn't seen any other cabins occupied this winter. Had someone abandoned it out here? The thought made anger flare in his gut, a welcome heat after so much cold emptiness. The puppy whimpered again, a sound so full of need and trust that it seemed to bypass all of Jake's carefully constructed walls. Before he could second-guess himself, he was scooping the tiny creature into his arms. The puppy burrowed against his chest, seeking warmth. All right, Jake muttered, more to himself than to his new companion. "Let's get you inside." The trek back to the cabin seemed both longer and shorter than before. Jake was acutely aware of the precious cargo he carried, the small life depending on him. As he climbed the porch steps, he realized his heart was beating faster than it had in months, not from exertion, but from a strange mix of concern and something that felt dangerously close to hope. Inside the cabin, Jake gently set the puppy down near the fireplace. The flames had died down to embers, and he quickly set about building them back up. As warmth began to fill the room, Jake turned his attention to his unexpected guest. The puppy was in rough shape. Its golden fur was matted and dirty, with small icicles clinging to its paws and belly. Jake fetched a towel from the bathroom and began to gently rub the puppy dry. As he worked, he found himself talking softly, words spilling out after months of near silence. "What were you doing out there, huh? You're just a little thing. Bet you're hungry too." As if in response, the puppy's stomach gave an audible growl. Jake couldn't help but chuckle, a rusty, unfamiliar sound that surprised him. When was the last time he had laughed? In the kitchen, Jake rummaged through his modest supplies. He hadn't been to town for groceries in weeks, preferring to subsist on canned goods and whatever game he could trap or hunt. Finally, he found some leftover venison from a deer he'd taken down last week. He warmed it slightly and mashed it up, figuring it would be easier for the puppy to eat. Returning to the living room, Jake set down the makeshift meal. The puppy, who had been dozing by the fire, perked up immediately. It attacked the food with gusto, tail wagging furiously. Jake watched, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The puppy's determination to survive, its simple joy in a warm meal and a dry place to sleep, stirred something in him that he thought had died along with Emily and their unborn child. As the puppy finished eating and curled up contentedly by the fire, Jake found himself at a crossroads. He had come to these woods to escape, to nurse his wounds in solitude. He wasn't ready to rejoin the world, to face the pitying looks and well-meaning but painful questions. But as he watched the small golden bundle breathing softly in sleep, Jake realized that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't meant to face his grief alone. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin, a tiny spark of warmth had been kindled. It wasn't enough to melt the ice around Jake's heart, not yet. But as he settled into his armchair, keeping a watchful eye on his new companion, Jake felt the first stirrings of change. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, figuring out where the puppy had come from, deciding what to do next. But for now, in this moment, the crushing weight of loneliness had lifted ever so slightly. Jake's eyes grew heavy as the fire crackled and popped. For the first time in nearly a year, he drifted off to sleep without the aid of whiskey or exhaustion, lulled by the gentle rhythm of puppy snores and the knowledge that, at least for tonight, he wasn't completely alone in the world. The days following the puppy's arrival brought subtle changes to Jake's isolated world. The cabin, once a silent monument to his grief, now echoed with the patter of tiny paws and occasional yips. Jake found himself talking more, if only to give simple commands or to reassure the small bundle of energy that seemed determined to explore every nook and cranny of its new home. At first, Jake tried to maintain some emotional distance. He told himself that he was just caring for the pup until he could figure out where it came from or find it a proper home. But as the blizzard raged on outside, trapping them together in the cozy confines of the cabin, Jake felt his defenses slowly crumbling. On the third morning after finding the puppy, Jake sat at his rustic wooden table, nursing a mug of strong black coffee. The puppy, having finished the makeshift breakfast Jake had prepared, a mix of softened kibble he'd found in the back of a cupboard and some mashed canned chicken, was now entertaining itself with a threadbare sock Jake had no recollection of dropping. As he watched the pup's antics, tugging at the sock, growling playfully, then doing a little victory lap around the living room, Jake felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. "You're a scrappy little fighter, aren't you?" he said aloud, his voice still rough from disuse. The puppy, as if understanding it was being addressed, stopped its play and looked up at Jake. Its tail began to wag furiously, thumping against the wooden floor. Then, with a joyful bark, it bounded over to Jake, placing its front paws on his leg and looking up with eyes full of trust and affection. Jake found himself chuckling, a sound that felt foreign in his throat. All right, he said, reaching down to scratch behind the pup's ears. "I guess you've decided you're staying, huh?" As the words left his mouth, Jake realized he'd already made his decision too. The thought of giving up this little ball of fur, of returning to the oppressive silence and loneliness, made his heart constrict painfully. He'd come to these woods to escape, to hide from a world that no longer made sense without Emily. But in just a few short days, this puppy had brought a spark of life back into his existence. "You need a name, don't you?" Jake mused, leaning forward to get a better look at the pup. Its coat, now clean and fluffy after a rather adventurous bath the day before, gleamed golden in the morning light filtering through the cabin windows. As Jake gazed into the puppy's trusting eyes, a memory surfaced, so vivid it almost took his breath away. It was Emily, her eyes sparkling with excitement as they discussed their future. They had been sitting on the porch of their Missoula home, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. "When we have a dog," Emily had said, her hand resting gently on her still flat stomach, "we should name him Buddy. It's such a friendly name, don't you think? Perfect for a family dog." Jake had laughed then, pulling her close. "We don't even know if it's a boy or a girl yet," he'd teased, referring to their unborn child. "Maybe we should name the baby first before we start naming our hypothetical pets." The memory faded, leaving Jake with a familiar ache in his chest. But for the first time, the pain was tinged with something else, a bittersweet fondness rather than the usual raw agony. He looked down at the puppy, who was now contentedly chewing on his shoelace. "Buddy," Jake said softly, testing the name. The puppy's ears perked up immediately, and it looked at Jake with what could only be described as a doggy grin. "You like that, huh? Buddy?" The newly named Buddy barked happily, tail wagging so hard his whole body wiggled. Jake felt a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, even as he blinked back unexpected tears. "All right then, Buddy it is." With the naming came a shift in Jake's perspective. Buddy was no longer just a temporary visitor or a problem to be solved. He was a companion, a living being that depended on Jake for care and affection. It was a responsibility Jake hadn't realized he'd been missing, a purpose beyond simply surviving from one day to the next. Over the next few weeks, as winter maintained its icy grip on the Montana wilderness, Jake and Buddy settled into a routine. Mornings began with Buddy's enthusiastic wake-up call, usually involving a cold nose pressed against Jake's face and a flurry of tail wags. They'd share breakfast, proper puppy food for Buddy now, after Jake had made the trek into town for supplies, and then head outside for their morning walk. These walks, once a solitary and often gloomy affair for Jake, took on a new character with Buddy by his side. The young dog's boundless energy and curiosity were infectious. Jake found himself pointing out various plants and animals to Buddy, explaining the difference between a spruce and a fir, or warning him about the dangers of provoking the local wildlife. "See that track there, Buddy?" Jake would say, crouching down to examine a print in the snow. "That's from a deer. We've got to be quiet if we want to spot one." Buddy would cock his head, as if hanging on every word, before inevitably getting distracted by a passing butterfly or an interesting smell. Back at the cabin, Jake found himself rearranging things to accommodate his new roommate. He fashioned a bed for Buddy out of an old wooden crate and some spare blankets, though more often than not, he'd wake up to find the pup curled up at the foot of his own bed. Slowly but surely, toys began to accumulate, a sturdy rope for tug-of-war, a rubber ball for fetch, and an assortment of sticks that Buddy deemed worthy of bringing inside. The silence that had once dominated the cabin was replaced by a new soundtrack. Buddy's nails clicking on the wooden floor, the jingle of the makeshift collar Jake had crafted from an old belt, the soft snores that emanated from wherever Buddy had chosen to nap. And, increasingly, the sound of Jake's own voice, talking to Buddy, yes, but also humming snatches of old songs as he went about his chores or even laughing out loud at some of Buddy's more ridiculous antics. One evening, as a gentle snow fell outside, Jake found himself sitting in his favorite armchair, a book open on his lap. Buddy was sprawled at his feet, gnawing contentedly on a rawhide chew. Without really thinking about it, Jake began to read aloud, his voice filling the cozy room with the adventures of Jack London's Call of the Wild. As he read, Jake felt a familiar pang. He and Emily had often read to each other, taking turns with favorite books or discovering new stories together. It had been one of the things he missed most about their life together. But now, as he looked down at Buddy's attentive face, Jake realized that while nothing could replace what he had lost, there was still room in his heart for new joys, new connections. The days began to take on a rhythm, a gentle ebb and flow of activities centered around Jake and Buddy's growing bond. Mornings were for walks and play, afternoons often found them working together, Jake chopping wood or making repairs around the property, with Buddy supervising from nearby. Evenings were for quiet companionship, sometimes with Jake reading aloud, other times simply sitting in comfortable silence as the fire crackled in the hearth. Buddy's presence seemed to act as a bridge, connecting Jake back to the world he had retreated from. When supplies ran low, instead of grimly forcing himself to make the trip into town, Jake found himself looking forward to the chance to pick up treats for Buddy or ask the local store owner for advice on puppy care. He even caught himself exchanging pleasantries with other customers, something he had studiously avoided in the past year. As winter began to loosen its grip and the first hints of spring appeared in the Montana landscape, Jake realized that something fundamental had shifted within him. The grief was still there, a constant companion that he suspected would never fully leave. But it no longer consumed him entirely. Buddy had brought laughter back into his life, a sense of purpose, and a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was still the possibility of light. One crisp morning, as Jake and Buddy stood on the porch watching the sunrise paint the sky in brilliant hues of pink and gold, Jake felt a sense of peace settle over him. He looked down at Buddy, who gazed back up at him with unwavering trust and affection. "Thank you, Buddy," Jake said softly, reaching down to ruffle the dog's ears. Buddy leaned into the touch, tail wagging gently. As they stood there, man and dog, Jake felt a flicker of something he hadn't dared to feel in a long time: hope. Hope for brighter days ahead, for healing, for a future that, while different from the one he had planned with Emily, could still be filled with love and joy. With a deep breath of the fresh mountain air, Jake squared his shoulders. "What do you say we go for a longer walk today, Buddy? Maybe check out that meadow over the ridge." Buddy's enthusiastic bark was all the answer he needed. As they set off down the path, Jake felt a small smile tugging at his lips. He wasn't okay, not yet. But with Buddy by his side, he was beginning to believe that someday, he might be. As spring began to unfurl across the Montana landscape, bringing with it a riot of wildflowers and the return of birdsong to the forests, Jake found his once orderly life transformed by Buddy's boundless energy and curiosity. The cabin, which had for so long been a quiet refuge from the world, now echoed with the sounds of paws scampering across wooden floors, the jingle of Buddy's collar, and more often than not, Jake's own laughter. Buddy, no longer the timid pup Jake had rescued from the snow, had blossomed into a ball of golden fur and endless enthusiasm. Each day brought new adventures and, inevitably, new messes for Jake to clean up. But even as he grumbled good-naturedly about muddy paw prints on the porch or another chewed-up shoe, Jake couldn't help but feel a warmth in his chest that had been absent for far too long. One particularly sunny afternoon, Jake decided it was time to tackle some long-overdue repairs on the cabin's roof. He set up his ladder, gathered his tools, and gave Buddy a stern look. "Now, you behave yourself while I'm up there, you hear?" Buddy wagged his tail in response, looking for all the world like butter wouldn't melt in his mouth. Jake had barely been on the roof for 10 minutes when he heard a commotion from inside the cabin. Peering over the edge, he saw Buddy prancing around the yard, proudly carrying what looked suspiciously like Jake's favorite flannel shirt. "Buddy, drop it," Jake called out, trying to sound authoritative. Buddy, of course, took this as an invitation to play, shaking the shirt vigorously and darting around the yard. What followed was a comic scene that would have had Emily in stitches, Jake thought with a bittersweet pang. He scrambled down the ladder, nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste, and chased Buddy around the yard. The young dog, delighted with this new game, led Jake on a merry chase, ducking under bushes and circling trees. Finally, breathless and covered in pine needles, Jake managed to corner Buddy and rescue his now thoroughly soggy and bedraggled shirt. As he stood there, shirt in one hand and an unrepentant Buddy grinning up at him with his tail wagging furiously, Jake couldn't help it. He burst out laughing, a deep, belly laugh that seemed to come from somewhere he thought had been lost forever. "You're trouble on four legs, you know that?" Jake said, reaching down to ruffle Buddy's ears. The dog leaned into the touch, clearly pleased with himself. As Jake headed back to the cabin to change, he realized he felt lighter somehow, as if the laughter had shaken loose some of the grief that had been weighing him down. These moments of chaos and joy became a regular part of Jake's days. There was the time Buddy decided to help with the laundry, pulling every item out of the basket and creating a trail of clothes from the cabin to the clothesline. Or the afternoon when Jake came back from chopping wood to find Buddy had somehow managed to knock over a bag of flour, turning the kitchen into a winter wonderland and himself into a powdery ghost. Each incident, while momentarily frustrating, served as a reminder to Jake of the vibrancy of life. He found himself engaging with the world again, his senses awakening to the beauty of his surroundings in a way they hadn't since Emily's death. The brilliant blue of the Montana sky, the rich scent of pine on the breeze, the warmth of the sun on his face, all of these things, which had faded into a grey backdrop of grief, now seemed vivid and immediate once more. Buddy's influence extended beyond just livening up the cabin. On their daily walks, which had grown longer and more adventurous as the weather improved, Jake found himself noticing things he had overlooked for months. He pointed out colorful wildflowers to Buddy, explaining their names and properties as his grandfather had once taught him. He paused to listen to the varied songs of returning birds, smiling as Buddy cocked his head in curiosity at each new sound. One crisp morning, as they hiked along a babbling creek, Jake spotted a flash of movement in the water. "Look there, Buddy," he said softly, crouching down. "See that? It's a cutthroat trout." Buddy watched intently as the fish darted among the rocks, his tail wagging slowly. Jake found himself telling Buddy about fishing trips with his dad, summers spent learning to tie flies and read the water. As he spoke, Jake realized it was the first time in ages he'd been able to think about happy memories without them being immediately overshadowed by grief. The pain of loss was still there, a constant companion, but it no longer felt all-consuming. Buddy's presence, his unconditional love and zest for life, seemed to be slowly but surely chipping away at the walls Jake had built around his heart. Back at the cabin, Jake dug out his old fishing gear from the shed. As he sorted through flies and checked the condition of his rods, he felt a spark of excitement he hadn't experienced in years. "What do you say, Buddy? Should we try our luck this weekend?" Buddy's enthusiastic bark was all the answer he needed. The fishing trip turned out to be both a comedy of errors and a healing experience. Buddy, fascinated by the flick of the line and the splash of the lure, couldn't seem to decide if he wanted to chase the fish or the fly. More than once, Jake found himself tangled in his line, trying to keep Buddy from plunging headlong into the creek while simultaneously attempting to land a fish. But as the sun began to set, painting the sky in breathtaking shades of orange and pink, Jake sat on the riverbank with a small string of trout and a contented dog by his side. The quiet sound of the water, the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, and Buddy's soft panting created a peaceful symphony. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt truly at peace. That night, as he prepared the trout for dinner, Jake found himself humming softly. It was an old song, one that Emily used to sing while she cooked. The realization didn't bring the usual stab of pain. Instead, Jake felt a gentle warmth, a sense of Emily's presence that was comforting rather than haunting. As spring melted into summer, Jake and Buddy's days fell into a new rhythm. Mornings were for long walks and play, afternoons for work around the cabin or exploring the surrounding wilderness. Jake started a small vegetable garden, chuckling to himself as Buddy helped by digging enthusiastically, and often in the wrong places. He even began to venture into town more frequently, picking up supplies and, to his own surprise, engaging in conversations with the locals. Mrs. Thompson at the general store always had a dog treat ready for Buddy and a kind word for Jake. Tom at the hardware store was full of advice about maintaining the cabin and stories about the area's history. Slowly but surely, Jake felt himself becoming part of a community again. He wasn't ready for large gatherings or lengthy conversations, but the simple acts of exchanging pleasantries or stopping to let someone pet Buddy no longer felt like insurmountable challenges. One warm evening, as Jake sat on the porch with Buddy at his feet, he found himself thinking about the future. For so long, he had been existing day to day, unable to look ahead. But now, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues, he felt a stirring of something that felt a lot like hope. He looked down at Buddy, who gazed back with unwavering affection. "What do you think, boy? Maybe it's time we started living again, huh?" Buddy's tail thumped against the wooden boards of the porch, a steady, reassuring rhythm. Jake knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The grief was still there, a part of him now, like a scar that would never fully fade. But as he scratched behind Buddy's ears, listening to the contented sigh from his furry companion, Jake felt ready to face whatever came next. The chaos Buddy had brought into his life hadn't erased the pain of his loss, but it had reminded Jake of the joy that could still be found in the world. Through muddy paws and chewed shoes, excited barks and warm cuddles, Buddy had shown Jake that it was okay to laugh again, to find wonder in small moments, to open his heart. As the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Jake stood up, stretching. "Come on, Buddy. Let's head inside." Together, man and dog walked into the cabin, no longer just a shelter from grief but a home filled with new memories and the promise of brighter days ahead. As summer faded into autumn, the Montana landscape transformed into a breathtaking canvas of reds, golds, and oranges. Jake found himself looking forward to the change of seasons, a stark contrast to the previous year when he had barely noticed the world around him. Buddy, now nearly full-grown but still full of puppy energy, seemed equally excited by the new smells and sounds that came with the falling leaves. One crisp October morning, Jake woke early, greeted by Buddy's cold nose pressed against his cheek. All right, I'm up," he chuckled, scratching behind the dog's ears. The air held a hint of frost, reminding Jake that winter wasn't far off. He needed to stock up on firewood to prepare for the cold months ahead. After a hearty breakfast of oatmeal for Jake and kibble for Buddy, they set out towards the wooded area behind the cabin. The forest was alive with activity, squirrels darting about, gathering acorns for their winter stores, and birds calling out their farewell songs before migrating south. Buddy trotted happily beside Jake, occasionally darting off to investigate an interesting scent or chase a fluttering leaf. Jake breathed in deeply, savoring the crisp autumn air. He felt more at peace than he had in a long time, though the familiar ache of loss still lingered. As they reached the clearing where he usually chopped wood, Jake couldn't help but think of Emily. She had always loved this time of year, with its vibrant colors and cozy evenings. "You'd like Buddy, Em," he said softly, looking up at the canopy of golden leaves above. "He's a good boy." Shaking off the momentary melancholy, Jake set to work. He had brought his trusty axe and several lengths of rope to bind the wood for easy transport back to the cabin. Buddy, sensing that it was time for Jake to work, settled down nearby, content to watch and occasionally chase the occasional chipmunk that ventured too close. The repetitive motion of chopping wood was therapeutic for Jake. The rhythmic thunk of the axe, the satisfying crack as each log split, the growing pile of neatly stacked firewood, all of it helped to quiet his mind and focus his thoughts. He lost track of time, working steadily as the sun climbed higher in the sky. It was nearly midday when disaster struck. Jake had just finished splitting a particularly stubborn log when he noticed a patch of ice hidden beneath the fallen leaves. Before he could adjust his footing, his boot slipped on the slick surface. He felt a moment of weightlessness, then a sickening crack as he landed hard on his left side. Pain exploded through Jake's body, radiating from his left leg. He bit back a cry, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Buddy was instantly alert, rushing to Jake's side with a concerned whine. "It's okay, boy," Jake managed through gritted teeth, trying to reassure the anxious dog even as he assessed his own condition. He attempted to move his leg and was rewarded with a fresh wave of agony. The leg was definitely broken, he could feel the unnatural angle even through his jeans. Panic began to set in as Jake realized the gravity of his situation. He was at least a mile from the cabin, with no one around for miles. His cell phone, which he rarely used out here anyway, was back at the house. The temperature was dropping as clouds rolled in, obscuring the sun and threatening rain or even early snow. "Buddy," Jake called, his voice strained. "I need you to go back, boy. Go home. Get help." But Buddy, loyal to a fault, refused to leave Jake's side. The dog paced anxiously, whining and occasionally licking Jake's face as if trying to comfort him. As the minutes ticked by, turning into an hour, then 2, Jake's situation grew more desperate. The pain in his leg was intense, and he could feel the cold seeping into his bones despite his layers. He tried dragging himself towards home, but the movement sent spikes of agony through his body, leaving him gasping and seeing spots. Buddy seemed to sense the direness of the situation. The dog's behavior changed, becoming more focused and determined. He barked sharply, as if trying to encourage Jake, then darted off into the woods. Jake's heart sank as he watched his faithful companion disappear among the trees. "Good boy," he whispered, hoping Buddy had finally understood and was going for help, even as a part of him ached at being left alone. Time became a hazy concept for Jake as he lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness. The pain in his leg had dulled to a constant throb, but the cold was becoming unbearable. He thought of Emily, wondering if this was how it would end alone in the woods, so close to the sanctuary he had built for himself. He thought of Buddy, hoping the dog had found safety and wouldn't suffer for Jake's carelessness. Just as Jake felt himself slipping into a dangerous lethargy, he heard it, a bark, distant but unmistakable. Then another, closer this time. Jake forced his eyes open, hope surging through him. "Buddy," he called weakly, his voice hoarse. Suddenly, Buddy burst into the clearing, barking excitedly. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, pushing through the underbrush, came a familiar figure, old Bill Henderson, Jake's nearest neighbor, though near was a relative term out here in the Montana wilderness. "Jake. Good Lord, son, what happened to you?" Bill's gruff voice was the sweetest sound Jake had ever heard. The older man knelt beside him, his weathered face creased with concern. "Slipped," Jake managed, gesturing weakly at his leg. "Buddy, how did you?" Bill chuckled, even as he began assessing Jake's injury with practiced hands. "That dog of yours showed up at my place, barking up a storm. Wouldn't leave me alone till I followed him. Smart animal you've got there." As Bill worked to create a makeshift splint and prepare Jake for the difficult journey back to the cabin, Jake felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He looked at Buddy, who was watching the proceedings with alert eyes, tail wagging slowly. "Good boy," Jake whispered, his voice thick with gratitude. "You're the best boy." The trip back to the cabin was arduous. Bill had brought a sturdy top which they used as a makeshift stretcher, but every movement sent jolts of pain through Jake's leg. Buddy stayed close, sometimes leading the way, sometimes dropping back as if to check on Jake's progress. By the time they reached the cabin, Jake was exhausted and in considerable pain, but overwhelmingly grateful. Bill helped him inside and got him settled on the couch, then set about calling for medical assistance. In these remote areas, emergency services often meant a helicopter evacuation for serious injuries. As they waited for help to arrive, Jake found himself reflecting on the day's events. He had come so close to disaster, saved only by the loyalty and intelligence of the dog he had rescued less than a year ago. Buddy lay beside the couch, his head resting on Jake's uninjured leg, a constant, comforting presence. "You know," Bill said, settling into a chair nearby, "I've been meaning to come check on you for a while now. After Emily, well, we were all worried about you, son. But it looks like you found yourself a pretty good reason to keep going." Jake nodded, absently stroking Buddy's soft fur. "I don't know what I would have done without him," he admitted. His family. The sound of an approaching helicopter filled the air, signaling the arrival of medical help. As the paramedics entered the cabin and began to assess Jake's condition, Buddy refused to leave his side, only moving when gently coaxed by Bill. As Jake was being prepared for transport, he called Buddy over. Looking into those loyal brown eyes, Jake felt a surge of love and gratitude. "You saved my life, buddy," he said softly. "I won't forget it." In the days that followed, as Jake recovered in the hospital, he had plenty of time to think. The accident had been a wake-up call, reminding him of the fragility of life but also of the unexpected joys it could bring. He thought of Emily often, but the memories were tinged now with warmth rather than just pain. And through it all, Buddy was there. Bill brought him to visit Jake in the hospital, much to the delight of the staff and other patients. Watching Buddy charm everyone he met, Jake realized that his life had changed in ways he never could have imagined when he first found that shivering puppy in the snow. As he prepared to return home, Jake knew that things would be different. He couldn't isolate himself anymore. The accident had shown him the importance of community, of connections. But more than anything, it had shown him the depth of the bond he shared with Buddy. "Ready to go home, boy?" Jake asked as Bill helped him into the truck, Buddy already waiting eagerly in the back seat. The dog's tail wagged furiously, and Jake couldn't help but smile. They had weathered this storm together, and Jake knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he and Buddy would face them side by side. As winter's icy grip on the Montana landscape began to loosen, Jake found himself on a journey of recovery, both physical and emotional. The accident in the woods had been a turning point, forcing him to confront the fragility of life and the importance of human connection. With Buddy by his side, Jake slowly but surely began to re-engage with the world around him. The first few weeks after returning from the hospital were challenging. Jake's broken leg, though healing well, limited his mobility and made even simple tasks around the cabin difficult. But where he once might have retreated further into isolation, he now found himself accepting help from his neighbors. Old Bill Henderson was a frequent visitor, bringing supplies and staying for coffee and conversation. Mrs. Thompson from the general store sent over homemade meals, her famous apple pie among them. Buddy, ever loyal, seemed to have appointed himself Jake's personal nurse. The dog rarely left Jake's side, always ready with a comforting nuzzle or a head placed gently on Jake's knee when the pain and frustration became overwhelming. On the tougher days, when memories of Emily threatened to drag Jake back into the depths of grief, it was Buddy's unwavering presence that anchored him to the present. As spring began to make its presence known, painting the landscape with splashes of green and the vibrant colors of wildflowers, Jake felt a corresponding thaw in his own heart. The long, dark winter of his grief was giving way to something new, not a forgetting of Emily, but a gentle integration of her memory into a life that was slowly expanding beyond the confines of loss. One sunny afternoon in early April, Jake decided it was time for a change of scenery. His leg, though still in a cast, was strong enough for short walks, and he was eager to breathe in the fresh spring air. "What do you say, Buddy? Want to head into town?" The enthusiastic wagging of Buddy's tail was all the answer he needed. The drive into the nearby town of Whitefish was a revelation. Jake hadn't realized how much he'd missed the simple pleasure of seeing other people going about their daily lives. As he parked his truck on the main street, he felt a mix of anxiety and excitement. Buddy, sensing Jake's hesitation, pressed close to his side as they began to walk down the sidewalk. It wasn't long before they encountered familiar faces. Tom from the hardware store waved from across the street, calling out a cheerful greeting. A group of teenagers cooed over Buddy, asking Jake if they could pet him. To his surprise, Jake found himself engaging in easy conversation, sharing the story of how he and Buddy had found each other. As they continued their stroll, Jake's eye was caught by a colorful mural on the side of a building. It depicted various animals, dogs, cats, horses, and even a few wild creatures native to Montana. Beneath the mural was a sign, "Whitefish Animal Shelter, all are welcome." Intrigued, Jake approached the building. Through the large front windows, he could see a bustling interior filled with animal cages and busy volunteers. Buddy's tail wagged furiously, picking up on the scents and sounds of his fellow canines inside. "Well, look who it is," a cheerful voice called out. Jake turned to see Sarah, a woman he vaguely recognized from his infrequent trips to the post office. She was wearing a volunteer t-shirt and had just exited the shelter, a bag of dog food slung over her shoulder. "It's Jake, right? And this must be the famous Buddy we've all heard about." Jake found himself smiling, a bit sheepish. "Word gets around, huh?" Sarah laughed, a warm, inviting sound. Small town, big hearts. We were all so relieved to hear you were okay after that accident. Buddy here is quite the hero." She bent down to ruffle Buddy's ears, much to the dog's delight. Before Jake knew it, he was being ushered into the shelter, Sarah's enthusiasm infectious. "You've got to meet Maggie, our shelter director. She'd love to hear Buddy's story." The interior of the shelter was a whirlwind of activity. Volunteers bustled about, feeding animals, cleaning cages, and providing affection to the many dogs and cats waiting for their forever homes. The noise was considerable: barks, meows, and the chatter of people, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, Jake found himself oddly energized by the atmosphere. Maggie, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, greeted Jake warmly. "So you're the man with the miracle dog," she said, smiling down at Buddy. "Sarah, why don't you show Jake around while I finish up some paperwork?" The tour of the shelter was eye-opening for Jake. He learned about the challenges they faced: limited space, tight budgets, and the constant influx of animals in need. But he also saw the dedication of the volunteers, the joy on the faces of families adopting new pets, and the transformations of animals who had come in scared and sick but were now thriving under the shelter's care. As they walked, Jake found himself sharing more of his own story: how finding Buddy had quite literally saved his life, not just in the woods during the accident, but every day since, by giving him a reason to keep going after Emily's death. "You know," Sarah said thoughtfully as they completed the tour, "we're always looking for volunteers. Especially people who understand firsthand the difference an animal can make in someone's life." Jake hesitated, the old instinct to retreat warring with a new desire to give back. He looked down at Buddy, who gazed back with those soulful brown eyes that had seen him through his darkest days. I'm not sure I'd be much help," he admitted. Maggie, who had rejoined them, placed a gentle hand on Jake's arm. "Sometimes, just being here is help enough. These animals, they've been through trauma too. They need patience, kindness, and someone who understands that healing takes time." Something in Maggie's words resonated deeply with Jake. He thought about his own journey over the past year, how far he'd come from those first dark days after Emily's death. He thought about the unconditional love Buddy had shown him, and how that love had slowly but surely brought him back to life. "Maybe," Jake said slowly, "I could come by once a week. Just to start." The smiles that lit up Sarah and Maggie's faces were answer enough. And so, Jake found himself with a new routine. Every Wednesday afternoon, he and Buddy would make the trip into town. While Buddy charmed the shelter staff and played with the other dogs, Jake would help out wherever he was needed, walking dogs, socializing cats, or sometimes just sitting quietly with the more fearful animals, offering them the patient presence he knew from experience could make all the difference. As the weeks passed, Jake felt a change in himself. The shelter work was challenging at times, confronting him with the reality of animal abuse and neglect. But it was also deeply rewarding. He saw scared dogs learn to trust again, watched as shy cats blossomed under gentle care, and experienced the joy of seeing animals matched with their perfect families. More than that, Jake found himself becoming part of a community. He chatted with other volunteers, swapped stories with adopters, and even started joining the shelter staff for the occasional lunch at the local diner. Slowly but surely, the world that had shrunk to the size of his grief was expanding again. One particularly memorable day, Jake was helping socialize a group of puppies that had been rescued from an abandoned property. As he sat on the floor of the play area, surrounded by wriggling, yipping balls of fur, he felt a laugh bubble up from deep inside him. It was a full, joyous sound that echoed through the shelter, causing heads to turn in surprise. Jake caught sight of his reflection in the window, and for a moment, he hardly recognized himself. The man looking back at him was smiling, his eyes bright with life. Buddy, who had been watching from just outside the pen, let out a soft woof, as if in approval. Later that evening, as Jake and Buddy sat on the porch of their cabin watching the sun set over the mountains, Jake felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. He thought of Emily, as he often did, but the memory no longer brought just pain. Instead, he felt a deep gratitude for the love they had shared and the life they had planned together. "You know, Buddy," Jake said softly, scratching behind the dog's ears, "I think Emily would be proud of us. We're doing okay, aren't we?" Buddy looked up at him, tail thumping against the wooden boards of the porch. In those warm brown eyes, Jake saw reflected all the love, loyalty, and hope that had brought him back from the brink. As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Jake knew that while his heart would always carry the scar of loss, it was also open once again to the beauty and possibility of life. With a contented sigh, Jake leaned back in his chair, Buddy a warm presence at his feet. The future, which had once seemed like an endless stretch of grey, now held the promise of new friendships, meaningful work, and countless moments of joy yet to be discovered. And through it all, Jake knew, Buddy would be right there beside him, every step of the way. As summer bloomed across the Montana landscape, painting the mountains and valleys in vibrant hues, Jake's life had taken on a rhythm he never could have imagined a year ago. The cabin, once a refuge from the world, had transformed into a bustling hub of activity. The walls, previously bare save for a few old family photos, were now adorned with colorful drawings from the children at the shelter, snapshots of adopted pets in their new homes, and of course, plenty of pictures of Buddy in various stages of playful mischief. Jake's involvement with the Whitefish Animal Shelter had grown far beyond his initial commitment of one afternoon a week. He found himself there almost daily, his natural affinity with the animals and his quiet, patient demeanor making him an invaluable asset to the team. The shelter staff and fellow volunteers had become like a second family, filling his days with purpose and his evenings with warm memories of lives touched and saved. One sunny morning in July, Jake sat on the porch, sipping his coffee and watching Buddy chase butterflies in the wildflower-dotted field in front of the cabin. The scene was idyllic, peaceful in a way that still sometimes caught Jake by surprise. He thought back to the dark days after Emily's death, how the beauty of this same view had been lost on him then, obscured by a veil of grief and isolation. As if sensing Jake's reflective mood, Buddy trotted over, resting his head on Jake's knee. Jake smiled, scratching behind the dog's ears. "You've been quite the life-changer, you know that," he said softly. Buddy's tail wagged in response, a steady thump-thump against the wooden porch boards. The sound of a car approaching broke the morning quiet. Jake looked up to see Maggie's familiar SUV coming up the dirt road. He waved as she parked, Buddy already bounding down the steps to greet her. "Morning, Jake," Maggie called out, laughing as Buddy circled her excitedly. "Hope I'm not interrupting your peace and quiet." Jake shook his head, smiling. "Not at all. Coffee." As they settled on the porch with steaming mugs, Maggie got to the reason for her visit. "We've got a situation at the shelter," she began, her tone serious but not alarmed. "A local ranch is closing down, and they've got about a dozen horses that need rehoming. I know it's not our usual fare, but I was thinking." Jake felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. "You want to take them in?" he asked, already running through the logistics in his mind. Maggie nodded. "It's a big ask, I know. We'd need to set up temporary paddocks, figure out feed and care. But Jake, if we don't step in, I'm afraid of what might happen to those horses." As Maggie laid out her plan, Jake found himself transported back to his childhood. He'd grown up around horses, his grandfather's ranch a second home during summer breaks. The memory of those sun-soaked days, the smell of hay and leather, the gentle nickering of horses at dawn, it all came flooding back. "I used to ride," Jake found himself saying. "My grandpa, he had a way with horses. Taught me everything he knew." Maggie's eyes lit up. "Jake, that's perfect. We could really use someone with horse experience. What do you say? Want to help us save some equine lives?" The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Jake threw himself into the horse rescue project with an energy that surprised even him. He worked alongside shelter staff and a growing number of community volunteers to set up temporary paddocks on a piece of land donated by a local farmer. His grandfather's old tack, long stored in the cabin's shed, was dusted off and put to good use. The day the horses arrived was both challenging and deeply rewarding. Some of the animals were underweight, others skittish from neglect. Jake found himself drawing on every lesson his grandfather had taught him, approaching each horse with a mix of patience, respect, and gentle firmness. There was one horse in particular, a dappled grey mare named Storm, who reminded Jake of his grandfather's favorite mount. Storm was wary of humans, shying away from touch and refusing to be led. Jake spent hours just sitting near her paddock, talking softly, letting her grow accustomed to his presence. One evening, as the sun was setting and Jake was preparing to head home, Storm approached the fence. She stretched out her neck, nostrils flaring as she took in Jake's scent. Slowly, carefully, Jake raised his hand. For a moment, they stood frozen in tableau. Then, with a soft nickering sound, Storm pressed her muzzle into Jake's palm. The simple act of trust brought tears to Jake's eyes. He thought of his grandfather, of Emily, of all the love and loss that had shaped his life. And he thought of Buddy, the loyal companion who had set him on this path of healing and connection. As summer faded into fall, the horse rescue project blossomed into something bigger than anyone had anticipated. The local community rallied around the effort, with donations of time, money, and supplies pouring in. Jake found himself at the center of it all, his natural leadership abilities emerging as he coordinated volunteers, worked with local veterinarians, and continued to work his magic with the more difficult horses. One crisp October afternoon, Jake stood watching as a young girl tentatively offered an apple to Storm. The once wary mare gently lipped the treat from the child's hand, nickering softly. The girl's face lit up with joy, and Jake felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the autumn sun. "You've done amazing work here," Maggie's voice came from beside him. "These horses, the kids who come to ride them, the families looking to adopt, you've changed so many lives, Jake." Jake shook his head, smiling. "We all did this," he said. "The whole community came together. He trailed off, searching for the right words. "You gave them a chance," Maggie finished for him. "Just like you gave Buddy a chance. Just like he gave you one." Later that evening, as Jake sat on the porch with Buddy at his feet, he found himself reflecting on the journey of the past year. He thought about the man he had been after Emily's death, lost, isolated, barely existing. He thought about the snowy night he had found Buddy, or perhaps when Buddy had found him. And he marveled at the life he now led, full of purpose, connection, and yes, even joy. Jake reached for the leather-bound journal on the side table. It had been Emily's last gift to him, intended for him to record their adventures as new parents. For the longest time, he couldn't bear to open it. But now, he felt ready. As Buddy watched curiously, Jake began to write. He wrote about loss and grief, about a golden puppy in a snowstorm, about learning to live and love again. He wrote about horses and healing, about a community coming together to make a difference. And he wrote about Emily, not just the pain of losing her, but the beauty of having loved her, of carrying her memory forward into this new life. The words flowed easily, filling page after page as the sun set and stars began to twinkle in the vast Montana sky. When he finally set down his pen, Jake felt a sense of peace settle over him. He looked down at Buddy, who gazed back with those soulful brown eyes that had seen him through so much. "We've come a long way, haven't we, boy?" Jake said softly, reaching down to ruffle Buddy's ears. The dog's tail thumped happily against the porch floor, a steady, comforting rhythm. Jake leaned back in his chair, taking in the beauty of the night. The future stretched out before him, no longer a daunting emptiness but a path filled with possibility. He knew there would still be difficult days, moments when the grief would resurface. But he also knew he had the strength to face them, with Buddy by his side and the support of the community he had grown to love. As a cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the promise of the changing seasons, Jake felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. For Buddy, for the shelter, for every person and animal that had been a part of his journey. For the chance to honor Emily's memory by living a life full of the love and compassion she had always embodied. With a contented sigh, Jake stood up, Buddy immediately at attention. "What do you say we go for a little walk before bed?" he asked. Buddy's enthusiastic bark was all the answer he needed. As they set off down the moonlit path, Jake Fisher, no longer just a man shaped by loss, but one rebuilt by love, compassion, and the unwavering loyalty of a golden retriever, felt ready for whatever adventure life had in store next. With each step, he moved forward into a future bright with hope, carrying with him the lessons of the past and the promise of tomorrow.